What he saw looked like an aircraft carrier with a cruiser beside it. That was the report of a Japanese scout pilot on May 7th, 1942, over the Coral Sea. But the ship below was not a carrier. It was the fleet oiler USS Neosho, a tanker loaded with aviation gasoline. That mistaken identification would send a wave of dive bombers straight toward her. That mistaken report would put the Neosho in the crosshairs of the Japanese fleet. But her fight for survival began 5 months earlier at Pearl Harbor. It was 7:55 in the morning on December 7th, 1941, a Sunday so calm and bright that the young fireman Bill Lew could hardly believe what his eyes were seeing. He had just rushed from the engine room of the big fleet oiler USS Neosho to his battle station, and now a Japanese bomber with the rising sun painted on its wings was flying so low he could see the pilot's laughing face. Across the harbor, the battleship Oklahoma was already capsizing, and men were diving into black, burning oil. Then the Arizona exploded 800 yards away, a blast that killed nearly half the dead at Pearl Harbor in a single instant. Lew's ship, tied up at Ford Island along Battleship Row, was still flying the Baker flag, the red square on a white field that warned she was discharging volatile fuel. Captain John Phillips stood on the Neosho's bridge and understood immediately that his ship was a bomb waiting to ignite. The tanker still held thousands of gallons of high-octane fuel and aviation gasoline. A single bomb or torpedo would turn her into an inferno that could destroy the onshore fuel depots as well. Without those fuel stores, no American response to this attack would be possible for weeks. Phillips gave the order to cut the mooring lines with axes, since no one was on the dock to cast them off, and the Neosho backed away from the berth under fire. The big oiler steamed across the open harbor, zigzagging, her 3-inch guns firing at the swarming aircraft, and reached Mary Point without a single direct hit. In those desperate hours, the Neosho did something that would define her fate. She survived when she had no right to. She was the only large fleet oiler the United States had in the entire Pacific, a fat girl built to carry 150,000 barrels of fuel and capable of steaming at 18 knots. And now the entire campaign to strike back at Japan would depend on her. The question was whether a ship built to pump gasoline, not to fight, and manned by young men from farm towns and logging camps could keep the fleet moving long enough to turn the tide of war. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, Captain Phillips drove his crew without rest. The Neosho shuttled from San Pedro to Hawaii and back, then out to sea with the remnants of the fleet, cruisers and destroyers still searching for the Japanese carriers that had vanished into the vast Pacific. The tanker refueled the old battleships that had survived, then the carriers Yorktown and Lexington as they arrived in theater, and every time she hooked up to a warship in heavy seas, the men had to lash themselves to the rail to keep from washing overboard. The crew trained constantly for air attack and damage control, drilling on the 20mm machine guns that had been bolted to the deck after Pearl Harbor, knowing that a tanker was a slow, fat target and that the enemy had already sunk 2 other American oilers that winter. Bill Lew learned his new battle station in the #1 magazine below the forward gun, passing ammunition up through a hatch while the ship rolled in the southern hemisphere swells. He and his shipmates worked with the engineers, the machinists, the water tenders, the black gang who toiled in the heat and grease of the engine rooms, keeping the boilers at full pressure so the Neosho could make her 18 knots and dodge whatever might come at her. Chief Petty Officer Robert Dicken, a signalman on the destroyer USS Sims that had been assigned to escort the tanker, practiced flashing recognition codes with his lamp, watching the horizon for periscopes or aircraft. Every man knew that if the Japanese found them alone, there would be no battleship batteries to shield them, only their own guns and their captain's nerve. By May of 1942, the Neosho had been running for 5 months without a break. Her crew exhausted but sharp, her engines still strong. The task force was assembling in the Coral Sea for what everyone sensed would be the first real test of American carrier power against the Japanese. Admiral Fletcher, cautious and methodical, ordered the tanker to a remote rendezvous point south of the fleet out of harm's way, with the Sims as her only protector. Captain Phillips told his men to take freshwater showers and put on clean clothes. The order was not about hygiene, it was about preparing for wounds, for burns, for the fight that everyone knew was coming. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. On the first day of May 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy set Operation Mo in motion. Troop transports and warships sortied from Rabaul aimed at the tiny harbor of Tulagi and the strategic prize of Port Moresby on New Guinea. The plan was bold and simple: seize both locations, establish air bases, and cut the supply lines to Australia. What the Japanese did not know was that Admiral Chester Nimitz, reading their decoded messages from Pearl Harbor, had already ordered Task Force 17 to intercept them. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the force built around the carriers Yorktown and Lexington. He knew he was outnumbered. The Japanese had thrown two big fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, plus the light carrier Shoho, into the operation. Fletcher also knew he could not afford to lose his only tanker. That ship was the Neosho, and she had been running hard for months, keeping his fleet topped off with fuel and aviation gas. Every captain in the task force understood the same truth. Without the Neosho, the American carriers would be dead in the water. On May 4th, Fletcher struck first. Planes from the Yorktown roared over Tulagi and caught the Japanese by surprise, smashing landing craft and seaplanes in the harbor. One of the pilots in that raid was a young lieutenant junior grade named Stanley Vettasa. His Douglas Dauntless took heavy fire, oil spraying across his windshield, and he barely made it back to the carrier. As he sat in the cockpit catching his breath, Vettasa learned that he and another pilot had been ordered to transfer off the Yorktown and ride the tanker Neosho back to Pearl Harbor. Vettasa packed his sea bag and watched it swing across the waves to the Neosho on a boatswain's chair. He waited on the flight deck, hoping for a last-minute reprieve. It came. His squadron leader appeared and told him to stay. The Navy needed every pilot it could get for the fight coming. Vettasa grabbed his bag and ran below. The Neosho steamed away without him, and he would later shoot down 3 Japanese Zeros in a single engagement, an act of skill that would become legend. He had escaped the tanker's fate by minutes. By May 6th, Fletcher was steaming northwest, chasing reports of the Japanese invasion force. The weather was closing in, squalls and haze reducing visibility. The admiral made a decision that would shape the next 48 hours. He ordered the Neosho to break off from the task force and proceed to a remote rendezvous point, a patch of ocean designated by the code words rye and corn. She would wait there, out of harm's way, ready to refuel any ship that needed it. Her only escort was the destroyer Sims, a ship with known boiler trouble and a crew that saw the assignment as a disappointment. At dawn on May 7th, the Neosho and the Sims steamed alone on a calm, bright sea. The weather was clear and visibility stretched for miles. The crew of the Neosho knew they were vulnerable. The ship still carried thousands of barrels of aviation gasoline in her tanks, and her deck was flat and wide, an easy target. Just after sunrise, the lookout spotted 2 aircraft on the horizon, little more than specks against the clouds. The executive officer, Francis Firth, studied them through his binoculars and told Captain Phillips they might be American. Phillips noted the sighting in the log and hoped Firth was right. 15 miles away, the pilots of those 2 aircraft were not American. They were Japanese, flying off the deck of the carrier Shokaku. The men had been searching for the American fleet since before dawn. Now, through the morning haze, they saw a large ship and an escort below them. The pilot of the lead plane banked for a closer look. What he saw looked like an aircraft carrier with a cruiser beside it. He pressed his radio key and sent the message that would seal the Neosho's fate. He had found the enemy carrier force. His report was wrong. But the strike planes were already warming up on the flight deck of the Shokaku, and they would be in the air within the hour. At 10:24 on May 7th, the radar on the Neosho lit up with inbound aircraft. Captain Phillips saw them first through his binoculars, a formation of Japanese dive bombers approaching from the southeast. He ordered hard a port, throwing the big tanker into a sharp turn. 2 bombs landed precisely where the Neosho would have been seconds later, throwing water high over the starboard rail. A third exploded 100 yards off, shaking the ship down to her keel. In the number 1 magazine below the forward gun, Bill Lew felt the concussion and heard cork plaster raining from the overhead. The three men working the ammunition hoist were knocked into each other, cursing. Above on the bridge, Phillips watched the first wave pull up and circle away. The Neosho had not taken a hit, but the gun crews had seen how close death could fly, and they kept firing blind into the sky. Ahead of the tanker, the destroyer Sims was also dodging bombs. Her 5-inch guns thudded, and one shell caught a Japanese bomber head-on. The plane disintegrated in midair. Chief Petty Officer Robert Dicken, still at his signal light, saw the wreckage rain into the sea. For a moment the sky was empty. Then a second wave appeared, low and fast, coming straight at the destroyer this time. Lieutenant Commander Wilfred Hyman, commanding the Sims, saw the plane split into two groups. The first bomb fell near his port side, close enough to rattle the bridge and smash his captain's gig. A second bomb hit the forward engine room. Then a third punched through the after deckhouse into the after engine room. The destroyer staggered, smoke and steam pouring from both compartments. Fire spread along the torpedo deck. On the Neosho, the men who were not firing their guns could only watch. The Sims was listing hard, her midsection already buckling. Men were jumping over the side. Hyman stayed on his bridge, ordering the remaining guns to keep firing. Then the destroyer broke in half. The bow lifted, the stern lifted, and she slid under the sea in less than 2 minutes. Of the 252 men on the Sims, only 14 would ever breathe again. Robert Dicken found himself in the water, swimming toward the only whaleboat still afloat. John Verton, his intestines burned by the shock wave of a depth-charge explosion, prayed for sharks to take him before he drowned. Vito Vessia reached the whaleboat first, started the engine, and began pulling men from the oil-slicked sea. They circled the wreckage, looking for faces they knew. Most they found were dead. Back aboard the Neosho, the Japanese were not finished. A dive bomber hit by anti-aircraft fire spiraled down trailing flame. The pilot did not ditch. He pulled the nose up and drove the plane straight into the Neosho's No. 4 gun enclosure. The impact slammed the aircraft across the deck, wreckage and fuel spreading fire in every direction. Executive Officer Francis Firth was standing near the mount when the plane hit. He saw the flames leap forward and did not run. Instead, he jumped, throwing himself over 3 sailors who were frozen in the path of the burning gasoline. Firth hit them hard enough to knock them flat, and the fire rolled over him. His face and arms blistered instantly. The 3 men he saved were burned but alive. The burning Japanese plane crumpled against the deckhouse, its pilot dead in the wreckage. Gun crews scrambled to contain the fire before it spread to the fuel tanks below. The No. 4 gun was silenced, but the flame was knocked down, and the ship held together for the next blow. In the crew's mess, a bomb had ruptured the bulkhead between the fire room and the compartment. Scalding steam poured through the gap. Chief Water Tender Oscar Peterson was knocked to the deck, his face and arms already blistering. He knew the 4 main steamline bulkhead stop valves were open, leaking pressure and killing men. Someone had to close them. Peterson pulled on work gloves and crawled into the fire room trunk, a tight space above the boilers. The air itself burned his skin. He reached the first valve and cranked it shut, then the second. By the third, his gloved hands were smoking. He closed the fourth before collapsing. The steam pressure was saved. Peterson was pulled out unconscious, his skin hanging, and would die days later from his injuries. The Neosho was dead in the water now. Her boilers had lost pressure, her turbines stopped, her electrical system out. The list to starboard crept past 20 degrees. Captain Phillips gave the order he had hoped never to give. Prepare to abandon ship and stand by. The message went out via runners, but in the chaos of smoke and fires, the words were garbled. Some men heard only abandon ship and went over the side. Bill Liu climbed out of the magazine and saw men jumping from the rails. He ran for the starboard side, grabbed the rail, and leaped into oil-thickened water. He did not have a life jacket. Someone had stolen his. Treading oil, he saw the ship's life rafts drifting away, empty. 2 of his friends from the gun mount swam up beside him, and together they kicked away from the sinking mothership. Phillips saw the rafts floating away unmanned. He saw Ensign Hargis alone in a whaleboat, trying to lower it by himself. He sent Gunnery Officer Lieutenant Commander Thomas Brown down to take charge. The whaleboats went out to pick up men in the water, but seas were building. The rafts were loaded with survivors, but they were not towed back. The Neosho still floated, but her deck was tilting harder and night was coming. By late afternoon, the fires were contained, but the ship was a wreck. Phillips counted the men he could see, enough to abandon ship if she went down quickly. The survivors in the water and on the rafts had no food, no water, and no guarantee anyone knew where to find them. The captain stood on his bridge, watching the sun slide toward a dark horizon, and waited for the next wave. Seaman First Class Jackie Rolston lay flat on his back, shrapnel lodged in his leg and shoulders. He was a 17-year-old from Missouri whose parents had signed his enlistment papers. Then a voice came from the water. Pharmacist mate Henry Tucker had stripped off his shirt, filled it with tubes of tannic acid burn cream, and was swimming from raft to raft. He climbed aboard each one, worked by the flickering light of a dying flashlight, and spread the ointment over raw, exposed burns. Tucker did not rest. He did not stop to catch his breath. By the time his light went dead, he had treated dozens of men, saving them from the infection that would surely have killed them by morning. May 8th dawned hot and still. The rafts had drifted far apart during the night, each one a separate speck on an empty sea. Tucker was still swimming. He had not slept. He moved from one cluster of survivors to the next, his supply of tannic acid running low, his arms growing heavy. Men urged him to stop, to rest, to save himself. He shook his head and pushed on, disappearing into the glare of the morning sun. Back aboard the Neosho, the remaining crew worked without rest. The ship listed so sharply that walking the deck required holding onto lines. Engineers opened valves to flood wing tanks on the high side, bringing in seawater to slow the growing list. Captain Phillips watched the horizon for smoke or masts, but saw nothing. The radio antenna was damaged. No one could hear them. The ship was a ghost, drifting on a current that carried her nowhere. On the morning of May 9th, a dot appeared in the sky. It grew larger. Men on the rafts waved, screamed, wept. An American search plane from the task force passed within 5 miles of the nearest raft. The pilot did not see them. He flew on, the drone of his engine fading into the haze. The men went silent. Some dropped their arms and stared at the empty sky. Another aircraft appeared later that afternoon. This time the survivors were sure they had been spotted. The plane banked, turned, and flew directly toward them. Then it straightened out and continued south. No signal, no dip of the wings. The rafts had been invisible against the gray-green water. By evening, the men were too weak to wave. Their tongues were swollen. Their wounds had begun to fester. Aboard the Neosho, the list had reached 28 degrees. Captain Phillips walked the tilted deck, speaking to each man still aboard. He told them the ship could flip at any moment. He asked if they wanted to take the remaining whaleboats and join the rafts. The men looked at the dark water, at the distant specks that might be their shipmates, and said nothing. Phillips made the decision for them. They would wait until dawn. On the rafts, the second night closed in. Jackie Rolston lay beside Ken Bright and Grove Huff. The 3 Missouri boys pressed together for warmth. No one spoke. The stars came out sharp and indifferent. Somewhere in the darkness, a man began to sing, softly a hymn from childhood. The song trailed off into silence. The rafts drifted on, carrying their cargo of wounded, thirsty, dying men into another day without rescue. The afternoon of May 11th came clear and hot over the Coral Sea. Aboard the listing USS Neosho, Captain Phillips had just decided to wait 1 more hour before ordering the final evacuation. Then a lookout shouted, pointing east. On the horizon, a single gray shape grew steadily larger. It was the destroyer, USS Helm, racing toward them at full speed. The faint silhouette of its masts and superstructure became the most beautiful sight any of the men had ever seen. Phillips ordered signal flares fired, and within minutes the Helm was alongside, her crew already tossing lines and life rings into the water. The rescue took most of the day. Whaleboats from the Helm fanned out across the swells, pulling exhausted, oil-caked men from 7 scattered life rafts. Bill Liu, barely conscious and blistered by the sun, was hauled aboard one of them. Robert Dickon, still commanding the leaky Sims whaleboat, guided his surviving men alongside the destroyer. John Verton, his bowels still burning from the shock wave, was pulled aboard the helm just as the whaleboat began to founder. Vito Vessia, who had kept the motor running, survived the ordeal and was transferred to a hospital ship. Francis Firth, his face and arms wrapped in burned bandages, was carried off the Neosho on a stretcher. Captain Phillips was the last man to leave his ship, walking slowly across the tilted deck and saluting before climbing down a cargo net. That evening, the helm sent 2 torpedoes into the Neosho's hull. The ship that had survived Pearl Harbor and 4 days of hell sank bow first into the Coral Sea. 3 days later, the survivors were in Australian hospitals. Navy investigators took statements from every man who could speak. The citations came quickly. Chief Water Tender Oscar Peterson, who had died of his burns during the rescue, received the Medal of Honor for closing those steam valves. Pharmacist's mate Henry Warren Tucker, missing and presumed lost, was awarded the Navy Cross for swimming between the rafts with his tannic acid. Captain John Phillips received the Navy Cross for his leadership. Lieutenant Commander Wilfred Hyman, who had remained on the bridge of the Sims as she went down, was posthumously commended. The Navy counted 175 survivors from the Neosho's crew and passengers. Of the Sims, 252 men. Just 14 had lived. After the war, Captain Phillips retired and spent his final years playing golf near San Diego. Bill Liu returned to Washington State, married, and raised a family, rarely speaking of his weeks on the rafts. Francis Firth carried the scars of his burns for the rest of his life, but never regretted knocking those 3 sailors flat. Robert Dicken went on to serve in the Pacific until the war ended. Edward Flaherty, badly burned but alive, was pulled from the sea and later wrote that he owed his life to the corpsman's quick thinking with the tannic acid. The records are silent on the later years of Jackie Rolston, Ken Bright, and Grove Huff, but they survived the ordeal, and that is what mattered. When you look at the long, painful road that American naval forces had to travel from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, remember that a stubborn oil tanker and her crew helped fuel that journey and then gave everything they had to stay afloat long enough to be remembered. If you have any family stories from the Pacific Campaign, letters, photographs, or memories passed down from a father or grandfather who served, we would love to hear them. Share them in the comments below, and we always read them. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps us keep telling these stories of ordinary men who did extraordinary things. Thank you for listening and for honoring their memory.